Welcome back, everyone, and happy Halloween weekend. Hope everyone's going to have a good time, party it up. Just be safe out there. Let's get back into it. Escobar and the Bride of Frankenstein drew apart. Escobar put his cigarette back in his mouth and smiled sadly at Fletcher. "Amigo, are you lying?" "No," he said. "Why would I lie? Don't you think I want to get out of here?" "We have no idea why you would lie," said the woman with the narrow blade of a face. "We have no idea why you would choose to aid Nunez in the first place. Some have suggested American naivete, and I have no doubt that played its part. But that cannot be all. It doesn't matter. I believe a demonstration is in order. Hines?" Smiling, Hines turned to his machine and flicked a switch. There was a hum, the kind that comes from an old-fashioned radio when it's warming up, and 3 green lights came on. "No," Fletcher said, trying to get to his feet, thinking that he did panic very well, and why not? He was panicked, or almost panicked. Certainly the idea of Hines touching him anywhere with that stainless steel dildo for pygmies was terrifying. But there was another part of him, very cold and calculating, that knew he would have to take at least one shock. He wasn't aware of anything so coherent as a plan, but he had to take at least one shock. Mr. Maybe I Can insisted that this was so. Escobar nodded to Ramon. "You can't do this. I'm an American citizen, and I work for the New York Times. People know where I am." A heavy hand pressed down on his left shoulder, pushing him back into the chair. At the same moment, the barrel of a pistol went deep into his right ear. The pain was so sudden that bright dots appeared before Fletcher's eyes, dancing frantically. He screamed, and the sound seemed muffled. Because one ear was plugged, of course. One ear was plugged. "Hold out your hand, Mr. Fletcher," Escobar said, and he was smiling around his cigarette again. "Right hand," Hines said. He held the stylus by its black rubber grip like a pencil, and his machine was humming. Fletcher gripped the arm of the chair with his right hand. He was no longer sure if he was acting or not. The line between acting and panic was gone. "Do it," the woman said. Her hands were folded on the table. She leaned forward over them. There was a point of light in which each of her pupils, turning her dark eyes into nail heads. "Do it, or I can't account for the consequences." Fletcher began to loosen his fingers on the chair arm, but before he could get the hand up, Hines darted forward and poked the tip of the blunt stylus against the back of Fletcher's left hand. That had probably been the target all along. Certainly, it was closer to where Hines stood. There was a snapping sound, very thin, like a twig, and Fletcher's left hand closed into a fist so tight his nails cut into his palm. A kind of dancing sickness raced up from his wrist to his forearm, to his flopping elbow, and finally to his shoulder, the side of his neck, and to his gums. He could even feel the shock in his teeth on that side, or in the fillings. A grunt escaped him. He bit his tongue and shot sideways in the chair. The gun was gone from his ear, and Ramon caught him. If he hadn't, Fletcher would have fallen on the gray tile floor. The stylus was withdrawn. Where it had touched, between the second and third knuckles of the third finger of his left hand, there was a small hot spot. It was the only real pain, although his arm still tingled and the muscles still jumped. Yet it was horrible, being shocked like that. Fletcher felt he would seriously consider shooting his own mother to avoid another touch of the little steel dildo. An atavism, Hines had called it. Someday he hoped to write a paper. Hines's face loomed down, lips pulled back and teeth revealed in an idiotic grin, eyes alight. "How do you describe it?" he cried. "Now, while the experience is still fresh, how do you describe it? Like dying, Fletcher said in a voice that didn't sound like his own. Hines looked transported. Yes. And you see, he has wet himself. Not much, just a little, but yes. And, Mr. Fletcher... Stand aside, the bride of Frankenstein said. Don't be an ass. Let us take care of our business. And that was only 1/4 power, Hines said in a tone of awed confidentiality. And then he stood aside and refolded his arms in front of him. Mr. Fletcher, you been bad, Escobar said reproachfully. He took the stub of his cigarette from his mouth, examined it, threw it on the floor. The cigarette, Fletcher thought. The cigarette, yes. The shock had seriously insulted his arm. The muscles were still twitching, and he could see blood in his cupped palm. But it seemed to have revitalized his brain, refreshed it. Of course. That was what shock treatments were supposed to do. No, I want to help. But Escobar was shaking his head. We know Nunez will come to the city. We know on the way he will take the radio station if he can, and he probably can. For a while, said the bride of Frankenstein. Only for a while. Escobar was nodding. Only for a while. A matter of days, perhaps hours, is of no concern. What matters is we give you a bit of rope. See if you make a noose, and you do. See if you make a noose, and you do. Fletcher sat up straight in the chair again. Ramon had retreated a step or two. Fletcher looked at the back of his left hand and saw a small smudge there, like the one on the side of Thomas's dead face in the photograph. And there was Hines, who had killed Fletcher's friend, standing beside his machine with his hands folded in front of him, smiling and perhaps thinking about the paper he would write. Words and graphs and little pictures labeled Figure 1 and Figure 2 and, for all Fletcher knew, Figure 994. Mr. Fletcher? Fletcher looked at Escobar and straightened the fingers of his left hand. The muscles of that arm were still twitching, but the twitch was subsiding. He thought that when the time came, he would be able to use the arm, and if Ramon shot him, so what? Let Hines see if his machine could raise the dead. Do we have your attention, Mr. Fletcher? Fletcher nodded. Why do you want to protect this man Nunez? Escobar asked. Why do you want to suffer to protect this man? He takes the cocaine. If he wins his revolution, he will proclaim himself president for life and sell the cocaine to your country. He will go to Mass on Sunday and fuck his coke whores the rest of the week. In the end, who wins? Maybe the communists? Maybe United Fruit? Not the people. Escobar spoke low. His eyes were soft. Help us, Mr. Fletcher. Of your own free will. Don't make us make you help us. Don't make us pull on your string. He looked up at Fletcher from beneath his single bushy eyebrow. He looked up with his soft cocker spaniel eyes. You can still be on that plane to Miami. On the way you'd like a drink, yes? Yes, Fletcher said. I'll help you. Ah, good. Escobar smiled, then looked at the woman. Does he have rockets? She asked. Yes. Many? At least 60. Russian? Some are. Others came in crates with Israeli markings, but the writing on the missiles themselves looks Japanese. She nodded, seeming satisfied. Escobar beamed. Where are they? Everywhere. You can't just swoop down and grab them. There might still be a dozen at Ortiz. Fletcher knew that wasn't so. And Nunez? She asked. Is El Condor at Ortiz? She knew better. He's in the jungle. Last I knew, he was in Belen province. This was a lie. Nunez had been in Cristobal, a suburb of the capital city, when Fletcher last saw him. He was probably still there, but if Escobar and the woman had known that, there would have been no need of this interrogation. And why would they believe Nunez would trust Fletcher with his whereabouts anyway? In a country like this, where Escobar and Hines and the Bride of Frankenstein were only 3 of your enemies, why would you trust a Yankee newspaper reporter with your address? Loco. Why was the Yankee newspaper man involved at all? But they had stopped wondering about that, at least for now. Who does he talk to in the city? The woman asked. Not who he fucks, who he talks to. This was the point where he had to move, if he was going to. The truth was no longer safe, and they might know a lie. There's a man, he started, then paused. Could I have a cigarette now? Mr. Fletcher, but of course. Escobar was for a moment the concerned dinner party host. Fletcher did not think this was play acting. Escobar picked up the red and white pack, the kind of pack any free man or woman could buy at any newsstand, like the one Fletcher remembered on 43rd Street, and shook out a cigarette. Fletcher took it, knowing he might be dead before it burned all the way down to the filter. No longer a part of this earth. He felt nothing. Only the fading twitch of the muscles in his left arm and a funny baked taste in his fillings on that side of his mouth. He put the cigarette between his lips. Escobar leaned further forward and snapped back the cover of his gold-plated lighter. He flicked the wheel. The lighter produced a flame. Fletcher was aware of Hines's infernal machine humming like an old radio, the kind with tubes in the back. He was aware of the woman he had come to think of without a trace of humor as the Bride of Frankenstein, looking at him the way the coyote in the cartoons looked at the Roadrunner. He was aware of his heart beating, of the remembered circular feel of the cigarette in his mouth, a tube of singular delight, some playwright or other had called it, and of the beat of his heart, incredibly slow. Last month, he'd been called upon to make an after-luncheon speech at the Club International, where all the foreign press geeks hung out, and his heart had beat faster then. Here it was, and so what? Even the blind found their way through this. Even his sister had, there by the river. Fletcher bent to the flame. The end of the Marlboro caught fire and glowed red. Fletcher drew deep, and it was easy to start coughing. After 3 years without a cigarette, it would have been harder not to cough. He sat back in the chair and added a harsh, gagging growl to the cough. He began to shake all over, throwing his eyebrows out, jerking his head to the left, drumming his feet. Best of all, he recalled an old childhood talent and rolled his eyes up to the whites. During none of this did he let go of the cigarette. Fletcher had never seen an actual epileptic fit, although the vaguely remembered Patty Duke throwing one in the Miracle Worker. He had no way of knowing if he was doing what epileptics actually did, but he hoped that the unexpected death of Thomas Herrera would help them to overlook any false notes in his own act. Shit, not again, Hines cried in a shrill near scream. In a movie it might have been funny. Grab him, Ramon, Escobar yelled in Spanish. He tried to stand up and stuck the table so hard with his meaty thighs that it rose up and thumped back down. The woman didn't move, and Fletcher thought, she suspects. I don't think she even knows it yet, but she's smarter than Escobar. Smarter by a mile, and she suspects. Was this true? With his eyes rolled up, he could see only a ghost of her, not enough to really know if it was or not. But he knew. What did it matter? Things had been set in motion, and now they would play out. They would play out very fast. Ramon! Escobar shouted. Don't let him fall on the floor, you idiot! Don't let him swallow his Ramon bent over and grabbed Fletcher's shaking shoulders, perhaps wanting to get Fletcher's head back. Perhaps wanting to make sure Fletcher's tongue was still safely unswallowed. A person couldn't swallow his own tongue, not unless it was cut off. Ramon clearly did not watch ER. Whatever he wanted didn't matter. When his face was where Fletcher could get at it, Fletcher struck the burning end of the Marlboro in Ramon's eye. Ramon shrieked and jerked backwards. His right hand rose toward his face, where the still burning cigarette hung askew in the socket of his eye, but his left hand remained on Fletcher's shoulder. It was now tightened down to a clamp, and when he stepped back, Ramon pulled Fletcher's chair over. Fletcher spilled out of it, rolled over, and got to his feet. Hines was screaming something, words maybe, but to Fletcher he sounded like a girl of about 10 screaming at the sight of a singing idol. One of the Hansons, perhaps. Escobar wasn't making any noise at all, and that was bad. Fletcher didn't look back at the table. He didn't have to look to know that Escobar was coming for him. Instead, he shot both hands forward, grabbed the butt of Ramon's revolver, and pulled it from its holster. Fletcher didn't think Ramon ever knew it was gone. He was screaming a flood of Spanish and pawing at his face. He struck the cigarette, but instead of coming free, it broke off, the burning end still stuck in his eye. Fletcher turned. Escobar was there, already around the end of the long table, coming for him with his fat hands out. Escobar no longer looked like a fellow who sometimes did the TV weather and talked about high pressure. "Get that Yankee son of a bitch," the woman spat. Fletcher kicked the overturned chair into Escobar's path, and Escobar tripped on it. As he went down, Fletcher stuck the gun out, still held in both hands, and shot it into the top of Escobar's head. Escobar's hair jumped. Gouts of blood burst from his nose and mouth from the underside of his chin where the bullet came out. Escobar fell flat on his bleeding face. His feet drummed on the gray tile floor. The smell of shit rose from his dying body. The woman was no longer in her chair, but she had no intention of approaching Fletcher. She ran for the door, fleet as a deer in her dark, shapeless dress. Ramon, still bellowing, was between Fletcher and the woman, and he was reaching for Fletcher, wanting to grab him by the neck, throttle him. Fletcher shot him twice, once in the chest and once in the face. The face shot tore off most of Ramon's nose and right cheek, but the big man in the brown uniform came on just the same, roaring, the cigarette still dangling from his eye, his big sausage fingers, a silver ring on one of them, opening and closing. Ramon stumbled over Escobar just as Escobar had stumbled over the chair. Fletcher had a moment to think of a famous cartoon that shows fish in a line, each with his mouth open to eat the next one down in size. The food chain, that drawing was called. Ramon, face down and with 2 bullets in him, reached out and clamped a hand on Fletcher's ankle. Fletcher tore free, staggered, and fired a 4th shot into the ceiling when he did. Dust sifted down. There was a strong smell of gun smoke in the room now. Fletcher looked at the door. The woman was still there, yanking at the doorknob with one hand and fumbling at the turn lock with the other hand. But she couldn't open the door. If she'd been able to, she'd have already done it. She'd be all the way down the hall by now and screaming bloody murder up the stairs. "Hey," Fletcher said. He felt like an ordinary guy who goes to his Thursday night bowling league and rolls a 300 game. "Hey, you bitch. Look at me." She turned and put her palms flat against the door, as if she were holding it up. There was still a little nail head of light in each of her eyes. She began to tell him he mustn't hurt her. She started in Spanish, hesitated, then began to say the same thing in English. "You mustn't hurt me in any way, Mr. Fletcher. I am the only one who can guarantee your safe conduct from here, and I swear I will on my solemn oath, but you must not hurt me." From behind them, Hines was kneeling like a child in love or terror. Now that Fletcher was close to the woman standing against the door of the death room with her hands pressed flat against its metal surface. He could smell some bittersweet perfume. Her eyes were shaped like almonds. Her hair streamed back above the top of her head. "We're not just fucking around," she had told him. And Fletcher thought, neither am I. The woman saw the news of her death in his eyes and began to talk faster, pressing her butt and back and palms harder and harder against the metal door as she talked. It was as if she believed she could somehow melt herself through the door and come out whole on the other side if she just pushed hard enough. She had papers, she said, papers in his name, and she would give him these papers. She also had money, a great deal of money, also gold. There was a Swiss bank account which he could access by computer from her home. It occurred to Fletcher that in the end there might only be one way to tell the thugs from the patriots. When they saw their own death rising in your eyes like water, patriots made speeches. The thugs, on the other hand, gave you the number to their Swiss bank accounts and offered to put you online. "Shut up," Fletcher said. Unless this room was very well insulated indeed. A dozen ordinary troops from upstairs were probably on their way now. He had no means of standing them off, but this one was not going to get away. She shut up, still standing against the door, pressing it with her palms, still with the nail heads in her eyes. How old was she, Fletcher wondered? 65? And how many had she killed in this room, or rooms like it? How many had she ordered killed? "Listen to me," Fletcher said. "Are you listening?" What she was undoubtedly listening for were the sounds of approaching rescue. In your dreams, Fletcher thought. The weatherman there said that El Condor uses cocaine, that he's a communist butt boy, a whore for United Fruit, who knows what else. Maybe he's some of those things, maybe none. I don't know or care. What I know about, what I care about, was he was never in charge of the ordinaries patrolling the Kaya River in the summer of 1994. Nunez was in New York then, at NYU, so he wasn't part of the bunch that found the nuns on retreat from Kaya. They put 3 of the nuns' heads up on sticks, there by the water's edge. The one in the middle was my sister. Fletcher shot her twice, then Ramon's gun clicked empty. 2 was enough. The woman went sliding down the door, her bright eyes never leaving Fletcher's. "You were the one who was supposed to die," those eyes said. "I don't understand this. You were the one who was supposed to die." Her hand clawed at her throat once, twice, then was still. Her eyes remained on his a moment longer, the bright eyes of an ancient mariner with a whale of a tale to tell. And then her head fell forward. Fletcher turned around and began walking toward Hines and with Ramon's gun held out. As he walked, he realized that his right shoe was gone. He looked at Ramon, who was still lying face down in a spreading pool of blood. Ramon still had hold of Fletcher's loafer. He was like a dying weasel that refuses to let go of a chicken. Fletcher stopped long enough to put it on. Hines turned as if to run, and Fletcher waggled the gun at him. The gun was empty, but Hines didn't seem to know that. And maybe he remembered there was nowhere to run anyway, not here in the death room. He stopped moving and only stared at the oncoming gun and the oncoming man behind it. Hines was crying. "One step back," Fletcher said, and, still crying, Hines took 1 step back. Fletcher stopped in front of Hines's machine. What was the word Hines had used? Atavism, wasn't it? The machine on the trolley looked much too simple for a man of Hines's intelligence. 3 dials, 1 switch marked on and off, now in the off position, and a rheostat, which had been turned so the white line on it pointed to roughly 11 o'clock. The needles on the dials all lay flat on their zeros. Fletcher picked up the stylus and held it out to Hines. Hines made a wet sound, shook his head, and took another step backward. His face would lift and pull together in a kind of grief-struck sneer, then loosen again. His forehead was wet with sweat, his cheeks with tears. This second backward step took him almost beneath one of the caged lights, and his shadow puddled around his feet. "Take it, or I'll kill you," Fletcher said. "And if you take another step backward, I'll kill you." He had no time for this, and it felt wrong in any case, but Fletcher could not stop himself. He kept seeing that picture of Thomas, the open eyes, the little scorched mark like a powder burn. Sobbing, Hines took the blunt fountain pen-shaped object, careful to hold it only by the rubber-insulated sleeve. "Put it in your mouth," Fletcher said. "Suck on it like it was a lollipop." "No," Hines cried in a weepy voice. He shook his head and water flew off his face. His face was still going through its contortions. Cramp and release, cramp and release. There was a green bubble of snot at the entrance to one of his nostrils. It expanded and contracted with Hines's stupid breathing, but didn't break. Fletcher had never seen anything quite like it. "No, you can't make me," but Hines knew Fletcher could. The Bride of Frankenstein might not have believed it, and Escobar likely hadn't had time to believe it, but Hines knew he had no more right of refusal. He was in Thomas Herrera's position, in Fletcher's position. In one way, that was revenge enough, but in another way it wasn't. Knowing was an idea. Ideas were no good in here, and here, seeing was believing. "Put it in your mouth or I'll shoot you in the head," Fletcher said, and shoved the empty gun at Hines's face. Hines recoiled with a wail of terror, and now Fletcher heard his own voice drop, become confidential, become sincere. In a way, it reminded him of Escobar's voice. "We are having an area of low pressure," he thought. "We are having the stinking rain showers. I'm not going to shock you if you just do it and hurry up, but I need you to know what it feels like." Hines stared at Fletcher. His eyes were blue and red-rimmed, swimming with tears. He didn't believe Fletcher, of course. What Fletcher was saying made no sense. But Hines very clearly wanted to believe it anyway, because sense or no sense, or nonsense, Fletcher was holding out the possibility of life. He just needed to be pushed a single step further. Fletcher smiled. "Do it for your research." Hines was convinced, not completely, but enough to believe Fletcher could be Mr. Maybe He Will, after all. He put the steel rod into his mouth. His bulging eyes stared at Fletcher, below them and above the jutting stylus, which looked not like a lollipop, but an old-fashioned fever thermometer. That green bauble of snot swelled and retreated, swelled and retreated. Still pointing the gun at Hines, Fletcher flicked the switch on to the control panel from off to on and gave the rheostat a hard turn. The white line on the knob went from 11 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. Hines might have had time to spit the stylus out, but shock caused him to clamp his lips down on the stainless steel barrel instead. The snapping sound was louder this time, like a small branch instead of a twig. Hines's lips pressed down even tighter. The green mucus bubble in his nostril popped. So did one of his eyes. Hines's entire body seemed to vibrate inside his clothes. His hands were bent at the wrists. The long fingers splayed. His cheeks went from white to pale gray to a darkish purple. Smoke began to pour out of his nose. His other eye popped out on his cheek. Above the dislocated eyes, there were now 2 raw sockets that stared at Fletcher with surprise. One of Hines's cheeks either tore open or melted. A quantity of smoke and a strong odor of burned meat came out through the hole. And Fletcher observed small flames, orange and blue. Hines's mouth was on fire. His tongue was burning like a rug. Fletcher's fingers were still on the rheostat. He turned it all the way back to the left, then flicked the switch to off. The needles, which had swung all the way to the +50 marks on their little dials, immediately fell dead again. The moment the electricity left him, Hines crashed to the gray tile floor, trailing smoke from his mouth as he went. The stylus fell free, and Fletcher saw there were little pieces of Hines's lips on it. Fletcher's gorge gave a salty, burping lurch, and he closed his throat against it. He didn't have time to vomit over what he had done. to Hines. He might consider vomiting at a later time. Still, he lingered a moment longer, leaning over to look at Hines's smoking mouth and dislocated eyes. "How do you describe it?" he asked the corpse, now while the experience is still fresh. "What? Nothing to say." Fletcher turned and hurried across the room, detouring around Ramon, who was still alive and moaning. He sounded like a man having a bad dream. He remembered that the door was locked. Ramon had locked it. The key would be on the ring hanging at Ramon's belt. Fletcher went back to the guard, knelt beside him, and tore the ring off his belt. When he did, Ramon groped out and seized Fletcher by the ankle again. Fletcher was still holding the gun. He wrapped the butt around on the top of Ramon's head For a moment, the hand on his ankle gripped even tighter, and then it let go. Fletcher started to get up and then thought, bullets. He must have more. The gun's empty. His next thought was that he didn't need no stinking bullets. Ramon's gun had done all that it could for him. Shooting outside this room would bring the ordinaries like flies. Even so, Fletcher felt along Ramon's belt, opening the little leather snap pouches until he found a speed loader. He used it to fill up the gun. He didn't know if he could actually bring himself to shoot ordinaries who were only men like Thomas, men with families to feed, but he could shoot officers, and he could save at least one bullet for himself. He would very likely not be able to get out of the building. That would be like rolling a second 300 game in a row. But he would never be brought back to this room again and set in the chair next to Hines's machine. He pushed the Bride of Frankenstein away from the door with his foot. Her eyes glared dully at the ceiling. Fletcher was coming more and more to understand that he had survived and these others had not. They were cooling off. On their skin, galaxies of bacteria had already begun to die. These were bad thoughts to be having in the basement of the Ministry of Information. Bad thoughts to be in the head of a man who had become, perhaps only for a little while, more likely forever, a desperacito. Still, he couldn't help having them. The third key opened the door. Fletcher stuck his head out into the hall. Cinder-blocked walls, green on the bottom half, and a dirty cream white on the top half, like the walls of an old school corridor. Faded red lino on the floor. No one was in the hall. About 30 feet down to the left, a small brown dog lay asleep against the wall. His feet were twitching. Fletcher didn't know if the dog was dreaming about chasing or being chased, but he didn't think he would be asleep at all if the gunshots, or Hines's screaming, had been very loud out here. If I ever go back, he thought, I'll write that soundproofing is the great triumph of dictatorship. I'll tell the world. Of course, I probably won't get back. Those stairs down to the right are probably as close to 43rd Street as I'm ever going to get, but... And there was Mr. Maybe I Can. Fletcher stepped into the hall and pulled the door of the death room shut behind him. The little brown dog lifted its head, looked at Fletcher, puffed its lips out in a woof that was mostly a whisper, then lowered its head again and appeared to go back to sleep. Fletcher dropped to his knees, put his hands, one still holding Ramon's gun, on the floor, bent and kissed the lino. As he did it, he thought of his sister, how she had looked going off to college 8 years before her death by the river. She had been wearing a tartan skirt on the day she'd gone off to college, and the red in it hadn't been the exact same red of the faded lino, but it was close. Close enough for government work, as they said. Fletcher got up. He started down the hall toward the stairs, the first floor hallway, the street, the city, Highway 4, the patrols, the roadblocks, the border, the checkpoints, the water. The Chinese said a journey of 1,000 miles started with a single step. I'll see how far I get, Fletcher thought as he reached the foot of the stairs. I might just surprise myself. But he was already surprised just to be alive. Smiling a little, holding Ramon's gun out before him, Fletcher started up the stairs. A month later, a man walked up to Carlo Arcuzzi's newsstand kiosk on 43rd Street. Carlo had a nasty moment when he was almost sure the man meant to stick a gun in his face and rob him. It was only 8 o'clock and still light, lots of people about. But did any of those things stop a man who was pazzo? And this man looked plenty pazzo. So thin his white shirt and gray pants seemed to float on him, and his eyes lay at the bottom of great round sockets. He looked like a man who had just been released from a concentration camp, or, by some huge mistake, a loony bin. When his hand went into his pants pocket, Carlo Arcuzzi thought, now comes the gun. Excuse me. But instead of a gun came a battered old Lord Buxton, and from the wallet came a $10 bill. Then, in a perfectly sane tone of voice, the man in the white shirt and gray pants asked for a pack of Marlboros. Carlo got them, put a package of matches on top of them, and pushed them across the counter of his kiosk. While the man opened the Marlboros, Carlo made change. No, the man said when he saw the change. He had put one of the cigarettes in his mouth. No? What do you mean, no? I mean, keep the change, the man said. He offered the pack to Carlo. Do you smoke? Have one of these if you like. Carlo looked mistrustfully at the man in the white shirt and gray pants. I don't smoke. It's a bad habit. Very bad, the man agreed, then lit his cigarette and inhaled with apparent pleasure. He stood smoking and watching the people on the other side of the street. There were girls on the other side of the street. Men would look at girls in their summer clothes. That was human nature. Carlo didn't think this customer was crazy anymore, although he had left the change of a $10 bill sitting on the narrow counter of the kiosk. The thin man smoked the cigarette all the way down to the filter. He turned toward Carlo, staggering a little, as if he was not used to smoking and the cigarette had made him dizzy. A nice night, the man said. Carlo nodded. It was. It was a nice night. We're lucky to be alive, Carlo said. The man nodded. All of us. All of the time. He walked to the curb where there was a little basket. He dropped the pack of cigarettes, full save one, into the litter basket. All of us, he said. All of the time. He walked away. Carlo watched him go and thought that maybe he was pazzo after all, or maybe not. Crazy was a hard state to define. The Afterword. This is a slightly Kafkaesque story about an interrogation room in the South African version of hell. In such stories, the fellow being interrogated usually ends up spilling everything and then being killed, or losing his mind. I wanted to write one with a happier ending, however unreal that might be. And here it is. So that closes out October and closes out In the Death Room. So next week, and for the rest of the year, because I've got this timed perfectly, next week we will be reading The Great Gatsby. So for the next 9 weeks, I believe it's 9. It's chapter 9. Yep, so for the rest of the year, we'll be reading The Great Gatsby, and it should finish right around New Year's. We'll see you guys next week.